A racist police officer brazenly stopped a car and unjustly detained two black men, completely unaware that one of them was a police captain. When the truth was revealed, everything turned upside down. What seemed like a minor mistake not only disrupted the lives of those involved but also exposed deep-seated injustice, forcing everyone to confront the reality of justice and equality. Late at night, the quiet streets stretched endlessly under the soft amber glow of streetlights, interrupted only by the occasional whoosh of distant cars. The stillness enveloped the surroundings like a comforting blanket, leaving a serene yet contemplative atmosphere for the few still awake. Inside a sleek car, John Carter, a senior police officer with over 15 years of experience, was driving home. Beside him sat David Miller, his close friend and partner in numerous community projects. The car glided smoothly along the suburban road, filled with the gentle strains of jazz music providing the perfect backdrop for their conversation. They had just left a meaningful charity event where they had worked together to raise funds for underprivileged children in the area. David turned to John, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Did you see the kids' faces? They were genuinely happy. With a few more events like this, I believe we can create something truly impactful." John smiled, his steady hands gripping the steering wheel. "We're not just helping them overcome immediate difficulties, we're giving them a chance to build a future. Sometimes a single ray of hope can change someone's entire life." David, leaning back in his seat, gazed out the car window at the small houses passing by in the dim light, their windows glowing faintly. "But you know, John, I think we can do more. It shouldn't stop at fundraising. We need to scale up, bring in bigger sponsors, and create a broader impact." John nodded, his eyes reflecting determination. "I've been thinking the same. Maybe next time, we should collaborate with major corporations or invite influencers to join the cause. We need their platform to amplify the message." David chuckled, his tone a mix of jest and sincerity. "You're never satisfied, are you? You've barely finished one thing, and you're already planning the next." "We don't have much time, David," John replied, his voice dropping. "Every day that passes is another child without enough to eat, another child not in school. We need to act now." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a police siren blaring from behind. John glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of flashing red and blue lights rapidly approaching. A police car was signaling them to pull over. David frowned, clearly caught off guard. "What do they want?" "We didn't do anything wrong." John calmly pressed the brakes, keeping his composure. He guided the car to the side of the road, his eyes still fixed on the rearview mirror. "I don't know, but let's follow their instructions. I don't want this to escalate." David glanced at John, then turned to look over his shoulder. An uneasy feeling crept into his chest. Even though he knew they had done nothing wrong, he couldn't shake the tension of being stopped by police in the middle of the night. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the deserted road, casting an uneasy glow over John and David's car. The police vehicle pulled up close behind, silencing its siren but leaving the lights flashing incessantly. The quiet of the night suddenly felt stifling. John sat still, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Two police officers emerged from their car, walking toward them with firm, deliberate steps. Leading the way was a young officer, his face cold and his eyes sharp, his movements exuding confidence. Behind him followed an older officer whose demeanor was calmer but whose eyes darted around as if weighing the situation carefully. David, sitting in the passenger seat, cast a sideways glance at John. "Why do you think they stopped us?" "We didn't do anything wrong." John didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to remain composed, but his eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror. As a senior officer, he knew all too well that being stopped by the police wasn't always for legitimate reasons. Though he didn't want to jump to conclusions, John couldn't ignore the reality that his skin color could complicate the situation. "Stay calm, David," John said in a low, steady voice. "I don't know what they want, but we haven't done anything wrong. Let's follow their instructions and see what happens." David nodded, but the unease in his chest lingered. He glanced at the mirror again, watching the flashing lights intensify his apprehension. The two officers approached the car. The younger one, later identified as Brian Smith, rapped on the window with two knuckles, the sharp sound cutting through the still night. John rolled the window down, maintaining a composed but cautious expression. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Smith didn't respond immediately. He stared at John for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to scrutinize every move, then curtly demanded, "License and registration." John nodded, reaching calmly for the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. "Here are my license and registration. May I ask why we're being stopped?" Smith took the documents without looking closely at them, giving them only a cursory glance. Then he turned his attention to David in the passenger seat. "And you, ID?" Smith said coldly, his gaze scrutinizing. David frowned, hesitating for a moment before replying, "I'm a passenger. I'm not driving. Why would you need my ID?" Smith raised an eyebrow, his face showing irritation. "Don't question me. Hand it over." David looked to John for guidance, and John gave him a slight nod, signaling him to comply to avoid escalating the situation. Reluctantly, David pulled out his wallet, extracted his ID, and handed it to Smith. Smith took David's ID and walked back to the police car, where Johnson stood waiting. The two exchanged hushed words, Smith's expression betraying unease. David's eyes followed them. "What do you think is going on?" he murmured to John. "Something's not right," John replied quietly, his tone cautious. "This doesn't feel like a routine stop." "But don't worry. We've done nothing wrong." David lowered his voice, his gaze still fixed on the officers. "Do you think this is because of?" He trailed off, reluctant to finish his thought. John turned to look at David, his expression serious. "David, I've been in this job long enough to know that sometimes it's not about what you've done but how you look. But we need to stay calm. Don't give them any reason to escalate this." David nodded, though frustration was evident on his face. He knew John was right, but the sting of perceived injustice gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Smith and Johnson continued their conversation near the police car, Smith occasionally glancing toward John and David, his face etched with suspicion. Johnson, though largely quiet, seemed less convinced about his colleague's approach. Moments later, Smith returned with their documents still in hand. "Step out of the car," he commanded firmly. John frowned, his expression stern. "Officer, we haven't done anything wrong. I have the right to know why you're asking us to step out." "You're acting suspiciously," Smith replied, his tone icy. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Realizing that resisting could escalate the situation dangerously, John took a deep breath. "David, let's just comply," he murmured before slowly opening his door. David sighed, his face a mix of frustration and resignation, but he stepped out of the car as well. Under the flashing lights, the tension in the air was palpable, a sense of unease spreading through the quiet night. Standing beside their car, John and David watched as Smith, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, signaled Johnson to come closer. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was no ordinary traffic stop. John and David leaned against the car as the red and blue lights of the police cruiser flickered, casting shadows around them. Brian Smith approached, holding a flashlight and a notebook. He stopped in front of John, his scrutinizing gaze fixed on him. "Stay still. I need to check a few things," Smith said without offering any explanation. John took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Officer, I've already handed over my license and registration. We haven't done anything wrong. Could you please explain why we're being stopped?" Smith smirked, his expression filled with suspicion. "That's not your concern. I'm doing my job. If you have nothing to hide, you'll cooperate." David, unable to suppress his frustration, stepped forward, meeting Smith's gaze. "We haven't done anything. You have no reason to act like this. This is harassment." Smith immediately turned to David, his voice sharp and threatening. "I won't say it again. Step back, stay silent, or things will get worse for you." John quickly placed a hand on David's shoulder, signaling for him to calm down. "David, it's not worth it. We need to handle this peacefully," John said, his voice steady but firm. David glanced at John, his face showing clear frustration, but he took a few steps back, trying to restrain himself. Smith eyed the two men with a judgmental glare before turning back to the car. Without asking for permission, he began shining his flashlight inside, inspecting the back seats and trunk from the outside. John frowned but maintained his composure. "Officer, you don't have a warrant to search the car. I do not consent to this." Smith paused, turning toward John. "Are you obstructing an officer in the line of duty? Is there something in the car you don't want me to see?" John held his gaze steady. "There's nothing to hide, but I also have rights. If you want to search, you'll need a warrant." Chris Johnson, standing nearby, stepped forward. His voice was calm yet firm. "Brian, stop. We don't have grounds to search this vehicle. We're only here for a document check." Smith turned to Johnson, his face showing irritation. "They're acting suspicious. Can't you see that? I have the right to investigate if I see fit." Johnson remained silent for a moment, but his expression clearly showed he didn't agree with how Smith was handling the situation. Meanwhile, David whispered to John, "See? They have no reason. This is just discrimination." John nodded, his voice low but resolute. "I know, but we have to stay calm. Let's not give them an excuse to escalate this further." Smith turned back, walking closer to John and David, his cold eyes fixed on them. "You two don't need to talk. I'm not done yet." He pulled out his notebook, pretending to jot something down, but it was evident he was simply stalling. "We've fully cooperated," John said, his voice calm but authoritative. "If there's no valid reason, we have the right to leave." Smith glared at John, his eyes glinting with defiance. "You'll leave when I say you can, not before." The tension in the air thickened, the red and blue lights continuing to flash incessantly. A few passing cars slowed down to observe, adding fuel to the growing tension surrounding John and David. At that moment, another car approached from the distance, its headlights illuminating the road. The car slowed to a stop a few meters away. A middle-aged woman stepped out, holding her phone and beginning to record the scene. "What's going on here?" she called out, her voice clear and challenging. Smith turned sharply, his cold eyes fixed on the woman. "What are you doing? This is police business, not yours. Get back in your car and leave immediately." The woman didn't flinch, keeping her phone pointed at Smith. "I see two men who haven't done anything wrong. Why are you treating them like this? I have the right to record if I believe it's necessary." Smith frowned, taking a few steps toward the woman, his voice lowering but filled with menace. "I won't say it again. Put the phone down and leave now, or I'll charge you with obstructing an officer. This is your final warning." The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing at John and David as if seeking their input. John, while appreciating her intervention, gave a small shake of his head, his eyes silently conveying that she shouldn't escalate the situation further. The woman lowered her phone with a sigh. "You're abusing your power," she muttered before returning to her car. She didn't drive off immediately but parked a few meters away, continuing to observe from a distance. Smith returned, his face irritated. He looked directly at John and David, his tone brimming with defiance. "You two stay right here. Don't move. I'm not done yet." Chris Johnson stepped closer to Smith, speaking for the first time, his voice firm and steady. "Brian, this has gone too far. We have no grounds to detain them. This is just a routine document check." Smith turned to face Johnson, his eyes flashing with anger. "They're acting suspicious. I have the authority to investigate further if I see fit. If you don't want to participate, step aside." Johnson frowned but said nothing more, stepping back slightly. Deep down, he felt the situation was spiraling out of control, but he knew Smith wouldn't easily relinquish his grip on the situation. John and David stood there, feeling a rising sense of helplessness. People like Smith didn't need reasons, only the power to act. David leaned toward John, his voice low and filled with frustration. "You see this? They don't need a reason. This is blatant discrimination." John looked at David, his eyes shining with quiet determination. "I know, but we need to stay calm. If they push further, we'll find a way to fight back. Nearby, Smith stood silently, listening but not reacting. Under the flickering lights of the police cruiser, John and David waited, knowing the night was far from over and that the challenges ahead would only grow. Smith took a step forward, his voice sharp and filled with authority. "Turn around. You're both being handcuffed for safety." John stared directly at Smith, his gaze a mix of disappointment and helplessness. "Officer, I have fully cooperated. There is no legitimate reason to handcuff us. I am Captain John Carter, a senior officer in the police force." Smith frowned, showing neither surprise nor concern at John's words. "I don't care who you are. I'm in charge here. Turn around now." David, standing beside John, couldn't stay silent. "Did you hear him? He's a senior officer. This is insulting and an abuse of power." Smith immediately turned sharply toward David, his eyes tense. His hand lightly touched the holster on his hip, making the atmosphere even heavier. "One more word from you, and I'll add obstruction to the list. This is your final warning." John placed a hand on David's shoulder, trying to calm them both. He knew that any act now could worsen the situation. "David, listen to me. Just do what they say." David looked at John, his eyes full of resentment, but he nodded. "We won't let this go," he said quietly, his voice low but determined. John slowly turned around, raising his hands. "I'm complying, but you will be held accountable for your actions," he said, his tone calm yet sharp. Smith said nothing more, quickly stepping forward to handcuff John. The cold clink of metal echoed in the air, a sound that felt like an insult to him, a senior officer, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice, now treated like a criminal. David was handcuffed right after. "We didn't do anything wrong," David emphasized again, his voice full of frustration. "Everything you're doing is because of the color of our skin." Smith didn't reply, but his expression showed visible tension. He glanced around, noticing a few cars slowing as they passed, the occupants inside curiously watching the scene unfold. Some people pulled out their phones and started to record. The red and blue lights continued to flash, illuminating John and David's faces. Now silent, they stood handcuffed on the roadside, their expressions conveying not just anger but also a deep sense of pain, not from Smith's actions but from the injustice they had to endure. "How does it feel to be treated like a criminal, huh?" Smith smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. John took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger from clouding his judgment. "You will answer for your actions," he said, his voice low and firm. "Not just to me but to the system you're abusing." Chris Johnson, standing a few steps away, began to look visibly uncomfortable. He glanced at John, then turned to Smith, his voice quiet but stern. "Brian, maybe we should stop. This is no longer a routine check. They've complied fully." Smith turned to Johnson, snapping, "Are you questioning me? We're following proper procedures. If they have nothing to hide, they don't need to worry." Johnson stepped back, his eyes showing clear dissatisfaction, but he said nothing further. Meanwhile, another car slowed as it passed. A man inside yelled, "This is racial profiling, and we're recording everything. You can't do this." Smith turned his head, his eyes flashing with anger. "Move along now, or I'll call for backup and have you join them." The man shook his head but drove off, leaving other onlookers still watching the scene unfold. John, now handcuffed, looked at Smith with a piercing gaze. "You know what you're doing is wrong, but I won't let this end here. You're betraying the values a police officer is supposed to uphold." Smith avoided John's gaze, though it was clear his initial confidence was beginning to falter. He turned back toward the patrol car to review more paperwork, saying nothing further. David turned to John, his voice quiet but filled with frustration. "John, this isn't just about us. This is about everyone who's ever been treated like this. We have to do something." John nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "And we will. But first, let's get through tonight." The two stood there, handcuffed and humiliated under the relentless flashing of the red and blue lights, knowing this was only the beginning of a battle for justice. The night dragged on as Smith and Johnson continued to linger near their patrol car, their conversation inaudible but clearly heated. John and David exchanged glances, their silent understanding forged through years of shared experiences. Finally, Johnson approached the patrol car's onboard computer. He decided to run a check on the identities of the two men standing before him. As he entered John's information into the system, his heart sank when the results appeared. It wasn't just John Carter, it was Captain John Carter, Regional Police Force. A senior officer with an impeccable record. Johnson's face paled. He turned to Smith, his voice low but urgent. "Brian, do you know who they are?" "That man is Captain John Carter. He's a senior officer in our force." Smith froze, his face turning pale. "What?" he stammered, his confidence visibly shaken. Johnson nodded, his tone tense. "You just handcuffed one of the highest-ranking officers in the region." Smith's hands trembled as he fumbled to unlock the handcuffs. "Captain Carter," Johnson began, his voice filled with remorse, "we didn't know. This was a grave mistake. I deeply apologize." John didn't respond immediately. His piercing gaze bore into both men, speaking volumes without a word. Smith stuttered as he removed the cuffs. I didn't realize." "I'm sorry." "You didn't realize because you didn't check," John replied, his voice calm but resolute. "You acted on assumptions. That's not how someone entrusted with upholding the law should behave." David stepped forward, rubbing his wrists. "Why did it take knowing he's a captain for you to remove the cuffs?" David asked, his voice laced with sarcasm and bitterness. "If he didn't hold that rank, would you have continued to humiliate us?" Smith had no answer. He simply stood there, eyes downcast, his face pale. John took a deep breath, suppressing the anger simmering within him. "Have you ever thought about the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his tone grave. "Not just for me but for everyone else you've treated this way? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you're truly protecting justice or simply abusing your power?" Smith lowered his head. "I was wrong," he muttered, his voice trembling. Johnson stepped forward, his voice firm. "Captain Carter, I also owe you an apology for not stepping in sooner. I should have acted before things escalated this far." John turned to Johnson, his expression softening slightly. "It's good that you recognize that, but an apology isn't enough. Our actions must reflect the values we claim to stand for." The air felt heavy as the red and blue lights continued to flash. Smith stood motionless, avoiding John's gaze, while Johnson appeared deep in thought. The woman who had been recording earlier slowly stepped forward, phone in hand. "I captured everything," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You need to understand this won't stop here. What I witnessed tonight wasn't justice." John looked at the woman and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but full of gratitude. "The truth will come to light." As Smith removed the last of David's cuffs, John turned to him, his tone now firmer. "I hope this serves as a lesson, Officer Smith. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. Our job is to protect, not oppress." Smith nodded slowly, not daring to speak. Johnson stood by, his gaze distant, as though grappling with a torrent of thoughts. John and David began walking toward their car, but before getting in, John turned once more to face Smith and Johnson. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice cutting through the night. "This is about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. You need to seriously consider why you do this job and whether you're truly worthy of it." Smith lowered his head, while Johnson silently gripped his flashlight tighter. John stepped into the car, and under the relentless flashing of the red and blue lights, he and David drove away, leaving behind a heavy silence and two men forced to confront their mistakes. Just hours after John and David left the scene, the video captured by the woman was uploaded to social media with the caption, "This is how the police treat innocent people just because of the color of their skin," a senior police officer humiliated on the street. The video quickly went viral. Within the first few hours, it garnered hundreds of thousands of views, with thousands of comments and shares. The online community expressed outrage over what they had witnessed, not only the injustice against John and David but also a glaring example of systemic racism in law enforcement. Hashtags such as #JusticeForCaptain Carter and #racial profiling began trending, igniting a wave of strong reactions from the public. Many individuals who had experienced similar situations shared their stories, turning this incident into the focal point of a broader conversation about societal injustice. Shameful. This is how they treat a senior officer. What about ordinary people like us? One user commented. We need real reforms. This kind of behavior cannot continue, another wrote. The story was further amplified by celebrities and human rights organizations, drawing national attention as major news outlets covered the incident with headlines like "Senior Officer Humiliated by Fellow Police, Racial Bias in Law Enforcement Exposed Again." Meanwhile, at John's home, his family received news of the incident from friends and relatives. His parents, who had witnessed their son overcome countless challenges to become a police officer, couldn't hide their concern. "John doesn't deserve this," his mother said, her voice breaking as she watched the video. "He's worked so hard all his life, only to be treated like a criminal on the street." His father, a retired teacher, shook his head quietly. He always said he wanted to change the system from within, but even as part of the system, they still don't respect him. David also received a flurry of calls from his family. His younger sister, who had always admired his determination and integrity, broke down in tears when she heard the news. "How could this happen? You didn't do anything wrong." David tried to reassure her, but he too felt the heavy weight of injustice pressing down on him. "It's going to be okay," he said. "John and I won't let this go." Within a single day, the incident had become a hot topic on major news channels. Reporters scrambled to contact John and David for interviews, while the police department faced mounting public pressure. "We are conducting an internal investigation," a police spokesperson stated during a press conference. "We are committed to addressing any misconduct if it is found." But those promises did little to quell the public's anger. Small protests began to emerge outside police headquarters, with signs demanding justice and systemic reform. After taking a day to recover and regroup, John and David decided to join the public dialogue. In a live interview, John shared his thoughts. "This isn't just about me or David. This is about a system that has refused to change for far too long. If this can happen to me, a senior officer, it can happen to anyone. We need to do something about it." David added, "I don't want anyone else to go through what we went through. We won't stop until everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." The incident went beyond being a scandal in law enforcement. It became a symbol of a larger fight for justice and equality. Human rights organizations, social activists, and ordinary citizens raised their voices, demanding meaningful change. Meanwhile, Smith and Johnson, the officers involved in the incident, faced tremendous pressure from both within the department and the public. Smith, in particular, was confronted with the possibility of suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. "This will change everything," John told David as they sat together after a long day. "It won't be easy, but this is our chance to push for the things we've always believed in." David nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "They've awakened something bigger than themselves, and we won't stop until real change happens." In the dim light of a new day, John and David understood that their fight was only just beginning. But this time, they weren't standing alone. They had an entire community behind them. The news about John and David's incident continued to dominate public discourse, forcing the police department to take concrete action. After a week-long internal investigation, the results were announced. Brian Smith would face serious disciplinary measures, including suspension and mandatory training on implicit bias and racial discrimination. At a formal press conference, a police department representative stated, "We acknowledge that this incident was not just an individual mistake but reflects larger issues within the system. It is time for us to reassess and make meaningful changes." Smith, who had initially been confident and assertive, now appeared before the disciplinary board with a weary and remorseful demeanor. In his statement, he admitted, "I acted improperly. I didn't thoroughly check the information before making my decision. That was my failure, and I take full responsibility." However, Smith's apology was not enough to calm public outrage. The mounting pressure pushed the department to commit to further actions to prevent similar incidents in the future. John, meanwhile, did not stop at seeking justice for himself. He understood that for this incident to bring about real change, broader reforms were necessary. John organized a major community forum titled Building Trust, Equity, and Fairness in Law Enforcement. The event, held at a large community center, attracted human rights organizations, social activists, and a diverse group of residents. In his opening speech, John said, "We live in a society where justice is not guaranteed equally for everyone. My case is just one small example among thousands of untold stories. Today, we are here to find solutions, not just to change a system but to change the way we see and treat one another." The forum quickly became a vibrant platform where people shared their experiences, opinions, and ideas. Some community members stood up to recount instances where they or their loved ones had faced unfair treatment due to prejudice. An elderly man spoke passionately, "I've lived through times when we had to fight for even our most basic rights. I never thought that, to this day, these issues would persist. Thank you, Captain Carter, for standing up and giving us the chance to speak about these matters." Human rights organizations presented statistics showing that bias in policing was not merely an individual problem but a systemic one, requiring reform from the ground up. At the end of the forum, John unveiled a three-step action plan to improve equity within law enforcement. 1. Implicit bias training. All officers would undergo regular training to recognize and eliminate unconscious biases in their work. 2. Increased transparency. Police departments would publicly report periodic data on traffic stops, including information about racial demographics and outcomes. 3. Community engagement. Law enforcement would hold regular meetings with residents to listen to their concerns and build trust through collaborative initiatives. The forum concluded with overwhelming support from the community. John felt that while this was only the first step, it was a vital one. Standing beside him, David clasped John's hand and said, "You've done it. This isn't just about us anymore. This is real change." John nodded, his eyes filled with hope. "There's still a lot to do, David, but at least we've started." As the crowd slowly dispersed from the hall, John and David sat down at the long table where a few leftover coffee cups from the morning remained. The space was quiet, bathed in the soft light of the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, easing the tension of a long day. David sighed, resting his chin on his hand as he looked at John. "Do you think this will lead to real change?" John took a sip of his cold coffee, his eyes contemplative. "I don't know, David," he replied slowly. "But if we do nothing, then nothing will change. What happened to us isn't the first time, and it won't be the last unless we act." David nodded, though doubt still lingered in his heart. "I just don't want this to fade into oblivion. We need to do something to make sure our story lives on so others won't have to go through the same thing." John sat in silence for a moment, then his eyes lit up as though an idea had struck him. "I'm going to write a book," he said firmly. David raised his head, startled. "A book?" "Yes," John continued, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I'll tell this story, not just what happened to us, but my entire journey in law enforcement. Everything I've seen and experienced. I want people to understand that injustice isn't just an individual problem, it's systemic. And I want them to know we can change that." David leaned back in his chair, smiling. "Sounds like a great idea. Who do you think will read it?" "Anyone who needs to hear it," John said, his voice low but purposeful. "People who've been through this, people who haven't but want to understand, and people in power who can change things. This won't just be our story, it'll be the story of thousands of others out there." David thought for a moment, then smiled. "If you're writing a book, then I'll take care of the rest. I'll visit schools and community centers. I'll talk to kids, help them understand their worth, and show them they aren't defined by society's prejudices." John tilted his head, admiration shining in his eyes. "That's a wonderful idea, David. Kids need someone like you, someone who can inspire them and help them believe in a better future." David chuckled, his tone lighter. "I'm not perfect, but if our story can help even one kid feel less alone, then I think it's worth it." The two sat in silence for a few moments, feeling the weight of their conversation. John looked at David, placing his hand firmly on the table as though emphasizing a point. "David, I promise I won't let our story be forgotten. We'll do everything we can to make sure this isn't just another incident lost in a few months." David nodded, his eyes shining with resolve. And I promise, John, that I won't stop until kids out there can grow up in a world where they don't have to be afraid just for being who they are." They shook hands, a wordless vow. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they had a responsibility to themselves, their community, and those without a voice. In the weeks that followed, John began writing his book, spending hours at his computer, typing each line to capture every emotion and detail of his journey. The book was not just his story but also a call to action, a message to anyone who wanted to change the world. Meanwhile, David started organizing talks at schools and community centers. He shared his story, listened to questions, and gave hope to children, showing them they could be whoever they wanted to be regardless of what the world thought. They weren't just standing up for themselves but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And this time, they knew they weren't alone. Their story had spread, becoming a flame of hope for a community yearning for justice and change. John's book, titled Justice Without Color, became a public sensation immediately after its release. Its raw, emotional accounts not only chronicled his journey but also served as a powerful call for fairness and societal reform. The book resonated with readers across the nation, sparking conversations in homes, workplaces, and schools. David, meanwhile, continued his inspiring talks at schools, becoming a key figure in spreading their message to younger generations. His words encouraged students to believe in themselves and to stand up against injustice. Their story was no longer just a personal incident, it had become the emblem of a larger movement toward a more equitable society. Conversations about injustice, discrimination, and the community's role in reforming the legal system sprang up everywhere. One chilly evening, as John drove home after a book signing event, he noticed a car skidding off the icy road and crashing into a guardrail. The car shuddered violently, with smoke rising from its engine. Without hesitation, John pulled over, turned on his emergency lights, and ran toward the vehicle. Inside was a family, a panicked mother trying to calm two crying children in the back seat and a father in the driver's seat, dazed and unresponsive. John knocked on the window, his voice firm yet reassuring. "Stay calm. I'm here to help." With the assistance of a few other passers-by, John managed to open the car door and get the family out safely, just moments before small flames began to lick the car's engine. When the fire department and paramedics arrived, the mother turned to John, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened without you," she said, her voice trembling. John simply smiled, his eyes soft. "It's what I'm here for. I'm just glad you're safe." News of John's heroic actions spread quickly, touching the hearts of many. For those who knew about the injustices he had faced, it was proof that even in adversity, he had held on to his belief in his duty and purpose. When David heard about the incident, he laughed and said, "That's John. He'll never give up his responsibility, no matter what." In a later interview about the event, John shared, "No matter what I've been through, I still believe my mission is to protect and help others. That's why I started this work, and it's why I'll never stop." John and David's story became an inspiration for many. Human rights organizations used their experience to raise awareness and push for reform. Schools invited them to speak and inspire the younger generation. Most importantly, their journey reshaped the community's understanding of justice and social responsibility. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe in their neighborhood, David looked at John, his eyes sparkling. "You know, John, we've done something big, not just for ourselves but for so many others." John smiled, his eyes gentle yet resolute. "And there's still so much more to do, David. But now I know we have an entire community behind us." They sat quietly, savoring a rare moment of peace, but they knew their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning, fueled by a steadfast belief that change was possible. As the day faded into evening, John and David left the cafe, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story was not just about fighting against injustice but also about hope, belief, and the power to transform an imperfect world. The story of John and David transcended their ordeal, becoming a symbol of the relentless pursuit of justice and change. Their efforts had ignited a movement that showed no signs of slowing down. Schools, community centers, and public forums became platforms where their message was amplified. People of all ages and backgrounds began to step forward, sharing their experiences and pushing for accountability and equity. John's book reached bestseller lists nationwide, and he found himself traveling across the country for speaking engagements. Each event was an opportunity to meet others who had faced similar struggles and to inspire them to take action. David's work with children gained momentum as well. He developed programs that focused on building confidence, leadership, and a sense of purpose among young people. He partnered with educators and community leaders to ensure the next generation would be equipped to challenge prejudice and fight for fairness. One evening, as John and David prepared for a joint event at a large conference hall, they reflected on the journey they had been on. "Do you ever think about that night?" David asked quietly, his voice tinged with lingering frustration. "Every day," John replied. "But not with anger anymore. That night changed everything for us and for so many others." David nodded. "It did. And I think it showed us that even in the worst situations, we can find a way to turn things around." The conference hall filled with applause as the two men stepped onto the stage. They spoke not just about their experience but about the larger fight for justice and equality. Their words resonated with the audience, a diverse crowd united by a shared vision of a better future. In the months and years that followed, John and David's efforts continued to grow. They became key figures in national discussions about police reform and racial equality. Their message was clear: change was possible, but it required courage, persistence, and a collective commitment to doing better. Their legacy was one of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that a single act of courage could spark a movement capable of transforming lives and communities. John's book, Justice Without Color, became a public sensation immediately after its release. Its raw, emotional accounts not only chronicled his journey but also served as a powerful call for fairness and societal reform. Meanwhile, David's inspiring talks at schools became key in spreading their message to younger generations. Their story was no longer just a personal incident, it had become the emblem of a larger movement toward a more equitable society. Conversations about injustice, discrimination, and the community's role in reforming the legal system sprang up everywhere. People shared their experiences, debated policies, and demanded concrete actions from their leaders. One chilly evening, as John drove home after a book signing event, he noticed a car skidding off the icy road and crashing into a guardrail. The car shuddered violently, with smoke rising from its engine. Without hesitation, John pulled over, turned on his emergency lights, and ran toward the vehicle. Inside was a family, a panicked mother trying to calm two crying children in the back seat and a father in the driver's seat, dazed and unresponsive. John knocked on the window, his voice firm yet reassuring. "Stay calm. I'm here to help." With the assistance of a few other passers-by, John managed to open the car door and get the family out safely, just moments before small flames began to lick the car's engine. When the fire department and paramedics arrived, the mother turned to John, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened without you," she said, her voice trembling. John simply smiled, his eyes soft. "It's what I'm here for. I'm just glad you're safe." News of John's heroic actions spread quickly, touching the hearts of many. For those who knew about the injustices he had faced, it was proof that even in adversity, he had held on to his belief in his duty and purpose. When David heard about the incident, he laughed and said, "That's John. He'll never give up his responsibility, no matter what." In a later interview about the event, John shared, "No matter what I've been through, I still believe my mission is to protect and help others. That's why I started this work, and it's why I'll never stop." John and David's story became an inspiration for many. Human rights organizations used their experience to raise awareness and push for reform. Schools invited them to speak and inspire the younger generation. Most importantly, their journey reshaped the community's understanding of justice and social responsibility. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe in their neighborhood, David looked at John, his eyes sparkling. "You know, John, we've done something big, not just for ourselves but for so many others." John smiled, his eyes gentle yet resolute. "And there's still so much more to do, David. But now I know we have an entire community behind us." They sat quietly, savoring a rare moment of peace, but they knew their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning, fueled by a steadfast belief that change was possible. As the day faded into evening, John and David left the cafe, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story was not just about fighting against injustice but also about hope, belief, and the power to transform an imperfect world. Their work continued to ripple outward. Justice Without Color remained on bestseller lists, its message reaching audiences across the nation and even internationally. John's candid and reflective narrative prompted deep introspection in readers, including police officers, community leaders, and policymakers. At the same time, David's community engagements gained momentum. His efforts to connect with schools, youth organizations, and local leaders began to cultivate a generation of young people who believed in fairness and the potential for change. His talks often ended with resounding applause, the kind that came from heartfelt connection and shared determination. The reforms John had proposed during the community forum began taking root. Local police departments adopted implicit bias training and initiated transparent data collection practices. While these steps were only a beginning, they represented a shift in the right direction. Months later, John was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. He stood before a packed auditorium filled with officers, policy analysts, and leaders. His voice was clear and firm as he addressed the audience. "When we take the oath to serve and protect, we pledge our allegiance not to power or authority but to justice and humanity. We must question ourselves, our biases, and the systems we uphold. True service means holding ourselves accountable, even when it's uncomfortable." The room was silent, the weight of his words resonating deeply. By the end of his speech, the crowd rose in a standing ovation, a recognition not just of his bravery but of the truth he had spoken. David, watching from the audience, felt a surge of pride. Later, as they walked together through the conference halls, he turned to John. "You've made them listen. That's something incredible." John shook his head modestly. "We've made them listen, David. This isn't just my fight, it's ours, and it always will be." Their fight wasn't without challenges. They faced criticism, resistance, and even threats from those who felt threatened by the change they represented. But they pressed on, buoyed by the support of their community and the growing movement for justice. Years later, their story became part of school curriculums, their efforts a case study in community resilience and advocacy. Children learned not only about the injustices John and David had faced but also about their determination to create a better world. In time, John's book was adapted into a documentary, further amplifying their message. The film's closing words, spoken by John, left a lasting impression. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without struggle. But if we stand together, if we hold on to hope and refuse to back down, we can build a world where justice truly knows no color." Through their journey, John and David became symbols of strength, perseverance, and the power of unity. Their legacy lived on, not only in the policies they helped change but in the countless lives they touched along the way. As the years unfolded, John and David's journey continued to evolve, inspiring people far beyond their immediate community. Their advocacy work began to shape larger discussions about systemic inequality, becoming part of the national fabric of change. John's leadership in law enforcement reform earned him a spot on a federal advisory committee tasked with addressing systemic bias in policing. This position allowed him to advocate for meaningful, widespread changes to law enforcement policies, including mandatory national standards for accountability and transparency. His proposals often sparked intense debates, but John never wavered in his commitment to justice. Meanwhile, David became a leading voice in community education and youth empowerment. His speeches and workshops reached thousands of young people, many of whom credited him with changing their perspectives on self-worth and resilience. David also spearheaded initiatives aimed at bridging gaps between communities and law enforcement, fostering dialogue that was long overdue. One such initiative, the Justice and Community Forum, brought together officers, educators, and local leaders to discuss challenges and solutions. At one event, David shared a poignant story with the audience. "I remember being a kid and looking at people in authority with fear instead of trust. That's not the kind of world I want the next generation to grow up in. We need to build a relationship based on understanding, not fear." The audience erupted in applause, affirming the impact of his words. The forum became a cornerstone of community outreach programs across the country, modeled as a framework for addressing distrust and fostering cooperation. John's second book, Beyond the Badge: Stories of Justice and Redemption, was published a few years after his first. It combined narratives from individuals he had worked with, officers, community members, and even those who had been on the receiving end of policing. The book emphasized the human side of justice, revealing the potential for change when people came together with honesty and empathy. The book once again became a bestseller, and John was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and even international summits on justice and equity. His words resonated deeply. Our systems are flawed, but they are not beyond repair. Change requires courage, accountability, and above all, the willingness to listen to those who've been silenced. David, who had continued his work with schools and youth organizations, found himself on a parallel path. His program, Voices of the Future, provided scholarships and mentorship to underprivileged students, ensuring that economic barriers wouldn't stand in the way of their potential. David often said, "If we can lift one child, we lift an entire community." Over time, the collaboration between John and David became a beacon of hope. They were invited to collaborate on a national campaign aimed at tackling racial profiling and promoting restorative justice practices. This campaign, titled Justice Together, used public service announcements, educational workshops, and policy advocacy to address deep-seated issues within the justice system. One of the most impactful moments of the campaign occurred during a town hall meeting in a historically marginalized community. A young boy stood up during the Q&A session, his voice trembling but filled with determination. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Carter, how do you stay strong when people treat you unfairly?" David walked over to the boy, knelt to his level, and said gently, "Because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. Sometimes the world will feel heavy, and you might feel small, but every step you take toward fairness and kindness makes the world lighter. Never stop walking that path." The boy smiled, and the room erupted in applause. That moment became a viral highlight of the campaign, symbolizing the hope and resilience John and David had worked so hard to foster. As the years passed, they both found joy in witnessing the ripple effects of their efforts. Communities that had once felt abandoned began to rebuild trust with local authorities. Students mentored by David went on to become lawyers, activists, teachers, and even police officers, all committed to carrying forward the principles John and David had championed. On the 10th anniversary of the incident that had sparked their journey, a documentary titled Justice in Action premiered to critical acclaim. It chronicled their lives, struggles, and the profound impact of their work. In one of the final scenes, John spoke directly to the camera. "People often ask if it was worth it, if all the pain, the battles, and the setbacks were worth the change we see today. My answer is always the same: absolutely. Justice is never easy, and the fight is never over. But every life touched, every heart changed, is a step closer to the world we dream of." David, seated beside him, added, "And we'll keep walking that path for as long as we can, because the work is far from done." The documentary ended with a montage of community events, youth programs, and legislative victories, underscored by a simple but powerful message: change starts with us. By the time the credits rolled, audiences were left inspired, moved, and ready to act. The legacy of John and David wasn't just about two men, it was about a movement that reminded the world of the power of resilience, unity, and hope. In the years that followed, John and David's work became embedded in the fabric of their community and beyond, leaving a lasting imprint on the pursuit of justice and equality. Their combined efforts were recognized not only as a triumph over personal injustice but as a catalyst for systemic change. John continued his role on the Federal Advisory Committee, where his voice became a cornerstone in shaping nationwide police reforms. One of his major achievements was helping to establish a National Equity and Accountability Bureau, NEAB, an independent body tasked with monitoring police conduct, ensuring transparency, and addressing public complaints. The Bureau was granted the authority to audit departments, recommend disciplinary actions, and provide mandatory training programs. At the NEAB's inaugural meeting, John delivered a keynote speech that set the tone for its mission. "This bureau is not about targeting officers, it's about holding us all to a higher standard. We are entrusted with the public's safety, and that trust must never be betrayed. Our job is not only to enforce the law but to embody the principles of justice, fairness, and compassion." David, on the other hand, continued expanding the Voices of the Future initiative. The program grew into a nationwide network of mentorships, scholarships, and workshops aimed at empowering young people from underserved communities. His ability to connect with youth made him a beloved figure among students, teachers, and parents alike. One particularly transformative moment occurred during a mentorship graduation ceremony. A young woman, now a law student, spoke about how David's guidance had changed her life. "When I met Mr. Miller, I didn't believe in myself. I thought my circumstances would always hold me back. But he taught me that my worth isn't defined by where I come from, it's defined by where I'm going. Today, I'm going to law school because I want to fight for people like me, just like Mr. Miller and Captain Carter fought for us." David, visibly moved, embraced the young woman as the audience erupted in applause. That moment encapsulated the essence of his work, empowering others to become agents of change. The Justice Together campaign also gained momentum, influencing public perception and sparking national debates about restorative justice practices. Public service announcements featuring John and David aired during primetime, emphasizing the importance of empathy and equity in policing. In one PSA, John spoke directly to viewers. "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about making communities whole again. Together, we can create a system that uplifts rather than divides." The campaign's impact was undeniable. Several states adopted new laws inspired by the principles outlined in John and David's advocacy, including mandatory community policing programs and independent oversight committees. As their influence grew, they were invited to the White House to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their contributions to social justice. During the ceremony, the president praised their unwavering commitment. Captain John Carter and Mr. David Miller remind us that real change is born from courage, resilience, and a steadfast belief in justice. Their journey has inspired a nation, proving that even in the face of adversity, hope and determination can triumph. Standing at the podium, John addressed the crowd. "This honor isn't just for us," he said. "It's for every person who's fought for justice, for every community that's demanded change, and for every child who dreams of a world where fairness isn't a privilege but a right." David followed, his voice steady and heartfelt. "This medal represents the power of unity. It's a reminder that together, we can overcome even the greatest challenges. But let's not forget, there's still so much more to do." The ceremony marked a turning point in their journey, but it did not signal the end of their work. They continued to push for reforms, support communities, and amplify voices that were too often silenced. One of their most ambitious projects came a year later, the establishment of the Carter Miller Justice Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to research, advocacy, and education on systemic inequality. The institute brought together scholars, activists, and policymakers to develop innovative solutions to complex social issues. It also funded grassroots initiatives, ensuring that change began at the community level. At the institute's opening ceremony, John and David unveiled a plaque bearing their motto, "Justice is not a destination, it is a journey we take together." The institute quickly became a hub of innovation, producing influential studies and hosting annual summits on justice reform. Young activists flocked to its programs, eager to learn from John and David's experiences and continue their legacy. Despite their growing national and international recognition, John and David remained deeply connected to their roots. They continued to attend local events, mentor students, and engage with the people who had supported them from the beginning. For them, the fight for justice was as much about individual lives as it was about systemic change. Years later, at a retirement celebration held in their honor, a community leader summarized their impact. "John Carter and David Miller didn't just fight for justice, they showed us what it means to live it." Their work reminds us that change is possible, even in the face of the greatest obstacles. As they stood before a room filled with friends, family, and supporters, John and David reflected on the journey that had brought them there. It was a journey marked by pain and struggle, but also by resilience, hope, and an unwavering belief in the power of unity. In his closing remarks, John said, "If there's one thing we've learned, it's that justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you build, piece by piece, with every action you take. We've come a long way, but the work isn't done. It never is." David added, "The fight for justice isn't a burden, it's a gift. It's a chance to leave the world better than we found it. And as long as there's work to be done, we'll keep fighting." Their words echoed long after the celebration ended, a testament to a life dedicated to the pursuit of justice. Their legacy endured, inspiring future generations to carry the torch and continue the journey toward a more just and equitable world.